So we're going to continue our study on in 1 Samuel, and I'd like to ask you to turn with me, if you'd like, to 1 Samuel chapter 15 and 16 and 17. We're going to be in these chapters. And last week when we began our class, we started with really trying to set the stage by going through 1 Samuel chapter 15, where Samuel comes to King Saul to tell Saul that he has been rejected by Yahweh, the God of Israel. And the reason for this was because Saul was given very specific instructions that he was to completely destroy the Amalekites. And instead, Saul did not do that. He and the leaders of the army kept Agag, the king, alive. And they kept the best of the spoil for themselves. And when Samuel approaches Saul about this, Saul says, well, it wasn't me, it was really the soldiers that did all of this. And he said, well, the reason you hear the bleating of the sheep is not because we intended to keep this for ourselves, but we were going to make offerings and sacrifices. And we don't know for sure whether that was the real story or whether that was an excuse. But nevertheless, God comes in and punishes Saul, and he does that by saying the kingdom will be taken from you. And so this week, as we begin in our Sunday school, we're going to be looking at chapter 16. And it's here in chapter 16 that Samuel now comes and anoints David, the shepherd boy, to be the new king in Israel. And as we look at the end of chapter 15, we're going to see that Samuel, despite having delivered this really strong rebuke to Saul, is in his heart hurting for Saul. I mean, he spent a lot of time with Saul. They were friends, if you will. And so now Samuel has no longer anything to do with Saul, but in his heart, he's hurting. And he feels bad about it in a way. And we see this at the end of the chapter. So we're going to look at chapter 15, 1 Samuel 15, and I'll have you look at the 34th verse. And it says, Then Samuel left for Ramah, but Saul went up to his home in Gibeah of Saul. Until the day Samuel died, he did not go to see Saul again, though Samuel mourned for him. And the Lord was grieved that he had made Saul king over Israel. And the Lord said to Samuel in verse 1, How long will you mourn for Saul, since I've rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I'm sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem, and I've chosen one of his sons to be king. And so what we now see is this story that we are, most of us are familiar with, where David goes to Jesse, and Jesse brings out all of his sons, starting with the oldest, as it should be, right, Rich? Absolutely. As a firstborn, we can say that, right? And so what Jesse does is he says, okay, that's terrific. I'm going to bring out my sons. And just as we lead up to this story where Jesse brings out his boys, I find it kind of interesting where you really see now, although Samuel is mourning for Saul, he still is afraid of him. He's afraid of Saul because he's delivered this hard message to him saying, you're not going to be the king anymore. And when God tells Samuel that he's got to go and anoint a new king, you can see Samuel's response in verse 2. He says, how can I go? Saul will hear about it and kill me. The Lord said, take a heifer with you and say, I've come to sacrifice to the Lord. Invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I'll show you what you'll do. You're to anoint for me the one I indicate. And Samuel did as the Lord said. And when he arrived in Bethlehem, the elders of the town trembled. Why do you think the elders trembled? Anybody have any ideas on that? anticipating a conflict. Very well could be the case, right? They're anticipating that Saul is going to come down and create a conflict with Samuel and, by extension, the people in the town of Bethlehem. Or it could be that a little tiny town like Bethlehem would not be normally one that would see someone as important as Samuel coming into their midst. And so if Samuel's coming into their midst, there must be something big going on. And so they're trembling, they're afraid, they're wondering, what in the world is happening here? And so Samuel did what he did, verse 4, and when he arrived in Bethlehem, the elders of the town trembled. And they asked, "Do you come in peace?" Samuel replied, "Yes, in peace. I've come to sacrifice to Yahweh. Come to sacrifice to the Lord God of Israel, Yahweh." And then he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. And when they arrived, verse 6, Samuel saw Eliab and thought, "Oh, surely the Lord's anointed stands before the Lord." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things man looks at. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." I mean, just a terrific passage here, right? It's one of these passages that we read and say, let's underline that one. That's a good one. The Lord looks at the heart. And yet our inclination is to do just the opposite. We judge the book by its cover. And if it were left to Samuel, Samuel would have made the very same mistake that the nation made in choosing Saul. They chose Saul because he was head and shoulders above everybody else, right? And Samuel comes out and sees Jesse's oldest and says, "Surely this is the one." But when we see this passage, it reminds, the passage I'm talking about is the Lord, looks not at the outward appearance. The Lord looks at the heart. It makes me think of that passage that we find in Isaiah 53 that talks about Jesus. And I just, if you want to just keep your finger here, or I can just read it for you. Some of you probably might even be able to recite it to me. But it's Isaiah 53 verse 2, and it says, "He had no beauty or comeliness," I think it says in the King James. "He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him. Nothing in his appearance that we should desire him." And that's the contrast, right? Man, we want to find that shiny object, that beautiful book cover, and God's looking at the heart. And so when we talk about the suffering servant in Isaiah 53, I think we can see a very specific example of that, where God is looking at the heart. There was nothing in Jesus that would attract us to him outwardly, but his heart was there. His heart was with God. Great lesson for us. And so the story goes on, and the account goes on, and it shows us that finally, after Jesse brings all his children before him, and God keeps telling Samuel, "It's not this one, it's not this one, it's not this one," they're sort of perplexed. And then they say, "Oh yeah, the youngest one isn't here." We might ask the question, why was that? Was it because he was simply tending the sheep? Or was it because he was so young they didn't consider it? Or because perhaps there was some tension, family tension, between David and his brothers? We get a sense that there was this tension in some of David's writings. So, for example, I'd like to have you turn to Psalm 69. So here is a psalm of David, and David gives us a hint about the struggle that was going on in his family. And we're going to look at verses 7 through 9. So David's writing here in this psalm, and he says in verse 7, "For I endure scorn for your sake, and shame covers my face. I'm a stranger to my brothers, an alien to my own mother's sons. For zeal for your house consumes me, and the insults of those who insult you fall on me." This gives us an insight into what was going on, perhaps, even at this early point in the family. And David now gets brought before Samuel, and he is obviously, as we know, chosen. Verse 12. So he sent and had David brought in. He was ruddy, was with a fine appearance and handsome features. And then the Lord said, "Rise and anoint him. He's the one." So Samuel took the horn and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. Why in the presence of his brothers? So they knew. So that there was the stamp from Samuel anointing David, saying, look, there's to be no discussion about this. The other day I was talking to a friend, and she was telling me the story about how her dad was dying. And her parents had a home that they wanted their daughter to inherit. And what the father who was dying did is he brought all his children in to see him and said, I just want you to know, and I want to tell you now, that when we distribute, my assets upon my death, that my daughter here will inherit this home, and the other assets can be split among you. And he did it in front of everybody so that there would be no question. It would be, this was Dad's desire, and we need to honor his wishes. And I think that perhaps that's why it was so important that when David was anointed, he was anointed in front of his brothers. This is the desire of the Lord God Most High. Who am I to question it? And so Rich and I, as the oldest in the family, who think rightfully it should be ours, we have to defer to God. It's a hard lesson, and it's one that they had to learn. It doesn't say, Dad. Question is, how old is David? Does anybody have any thoughts on that?
I've always thought that he was a teenager, 16, 17 years old.
Yeah, it makes sense to me. And one of the reasons why I think that makes sense, that he was a teenager, 16 or 17 years old, is what we find next in chapter 17. Chapter 17 is the account of David fighting Goliath. And what happens is Saul looks at David about to go out and fight this giant and hands him this infantryman's armor and says, put this on. And David's swimming in it, And it's so heavy he can't carry it. And David says, I can't wear these. I'm not used to them. I've never worn anything like this. And that, to me, gives me the sense that he was a younger kid. Yeah. Jim?
If he was fighting age, if he was 20, he would have been that was the fighting age of Israel.
Great point. I hadn't thought of that. Yeah. So Jim's point, for those that are watching online, Jim says the fighting age in Israel was 20. And so if David were 20 years old, he would have been there at the battle, as opposed to have been back at the farm. Yeah. Kelly?
Was he 40 when he began to reign?
I don't remember. Anybody know? How old was David when he began to reign? 40. Yeah.
Long time from anointing
Yeah.
to reigning.
There's a good lesson in patience, right? Yeah. So, hey, what I want to do now is I want to skip ahead to chapter 17. Just as an aside, chapter 16, verse 14 through the end of the chapter, there are a lot of Bible commentators that suggest that this section of passages is sort of out of order chronology, from a chronological standpoint. Because it's talking about David being a warrior in verse 18. He's a brave man and a warrior, it says, of David. And David, as we just said, and as we're going to see in chapter 17, had no experience fighting. And so for that reason, there are many commentators that think that chapter 16, verses 14 to the end, should probably better be placed after chapter 17. And I don't know, but it seems to make sense to me. So let's skip over now to chapter 17, and for the balance of our class this morning, we're going to talk about the land of Israel, because it plays a very important part in understanding the story of David and Goliath. And if time permits, we'll move beyond a discussion of the land of Israel, and we'll start talking about the actual battle between David and Goliath and between the Israelites and the Philistines. And so when we think about the land of Israel, what I want you to do is I want you to think of Israel being divided into 4 separate corridors that run north to south. And from a geological standpoint, you can see in the land there are 4 very separate, distinct areas of land. On the west-hand side, on the left-hand side of the screen, we see something called the coastal plain. This is the area that runs along the Mediterranean Sea. You've got cities like Caesarea right on the coast, Gaza right on the coast. The coast was a very flat land. It was a land that, that was at sea level, as you might imagine. But when you look at that slide, you'll notice the Mediterranean there are no ports there. Now, James is an experienced boat captain. A port is an important thing. And it gives us an idea as to why the Israelites were not seafaring people the way the Philistines were, who came likely from the island of Crete. So if there were no ports there, it would be a very difficult place to develop some sort of navy, if you will, or even any sort of permanent fishing village, because the boats would always be buffeted by the storms. So when we think of the land of Israel, remember, what we're talking about are 4 distinct separate corridors. The first one that we're looking at is this coastal plain. It's flat, it's sea level, it's right against the Mediterranean, and you've got Caesarea in the north, and you've got Gaza in the south as an example. So just think about that. This area during the time of Saul and David was inhabited mostly by the Philistines. So the Philistines are thought to have come over from one of the islands, or maybe several of the islands in the Mediterranean, and they have now landed there, and they're occupying, for the most part, the coastal plain. The second area, or the second corridor that runs north to south, is the mountain area. It's this mountainous region. It's the hill country. And if you think about Israel, you find that it's really broken down. When you think about the mountain range, you've got Gibeah in the north. So if you look at the letter Y in country, that's where Gibeah might be. This is where Saul had his base camp, Gibeah of Saul. Beneath Gibeah, you've got Jerusalem. Beneath Jerusalem, you've got Bethlehem. Then down in the southern part, maybe close to the letter H, you've got Hebron. Hebron is where Abraham, for example, was buried. Hebron is where David set up camp. As far away from Gibeah as you could imagine, along this northern ridge, along this north-south ridge of mountains. So the second corridor that we're talking about is the hill country. Most of what we're going to see in our class today is going to be focused on these 2 corridors, the coastal plain and the mountain areas. But there are 2 other categories that we'll see, 2 other corridors of land. The third is the Rift Valley. This is the Jordan River Valley. This is down, again, very, very low topographically. So, if you start at the Mediterranean, you climb up to the hill country, to Jerusalem, and then you descend and descend and descend until you get to the river, the Jordan River. That's where Jericho was, for example. A gorgeous area, an area where there were palm trees, and it was warm, and it was beautiful. And then the last area that we see is this plateau. This is on the other side. This is where the half-tribe of Manasseh and Gad, for example, inherited their land. This is in the northern area where the letter U is in plateau. That would be where Basan is. Remember we read about the bulls of Bashan? This was a very fertile area. It was a gorgeous area. So those are the very four distinct categories of land. The weather was different in these different four corridors, north to south. In the Mediterranean, you know, it was a coastal region, sandy. You've got the mountain area. You know, people have climbed the White Mountains. You know what it's like. Jerusalem is at about 2,800 feet above sea level. So it's not like Mount Washington. It's not like, you know, some of the big mountains. But I think, you know, as an example, Blue Hills in our neck of the woods. Blue Hills is only about 800 feet above sea level. So this is 2,800 feet. You know, you go up to the top of Blue Hill, you have a beautiful view of Boston, right? You go up there, you can see the city, and it looks great. Jerusalem was significantly higher than that. So when we think about these four north-south corridors, the other thing we have to think about is, how do people get around in those days? And there were, believe it or not, there were highways. There were roads that were understood, that were used and traveled, and we can read about these roads in the scriptures. The first one that we read about is this one that runs through the north-south region of the coastal plain. And this was, as they call it, the coastal highway. Must have been the scenic route, right? Jeff and Kelly have been traveling across the country, and they said that when they left, they decided they weren't going to take any main highways. They weren't going to get on the interstate. They were going to, you know, sort of meander their way across the country. And I would think that the coastal route was a, you know, maybe that was, I think of a coastal route as a scenic route. But this truly was an international route. When you think about where Israel is located on the global map, you know, you've got Egypt in the south, and you've got Babylon in the north. And in order to get to one place to the other, they've got to go through Israel. And this was the route that they would often take. So again, the reason I'm showing you this is because this was a known travel corridor along that coastal region. The second road runs, again, north-south, and this is the road of the patriarchs, it's called. And the Bible will reference these roads. They will travel on these roads, and it will use references like they took the coastal highway, or they were on the road of the patriarchs. And this road ran right along the ridge, and it started down south in the Negev, and it would eventually climb up onto the coastal, you know, away from the coastal plain, away from the wilderness area, up onto the mountain area, and it would travel north or travel south. That was the road of the patriarchs. There was the Rift Valley Road, and then there was the King's Highway that would take you along the Transjordanian area. So there was one north-south highway for each geographical region. I think it's kind of fascinating. But what I want to talk about today, as it relates to David and Goliath, is the fact that there was an area between the coastal region, which was down flat against the Mediterranean, and the hill country where Jerusalem and Hebron and Bethlehem and what was the other one? Gibeah, thank you. Where these cities were located. And in order to travel, not north-south, but in order to travel from the west to the east and vice versa, what they discovered, what geologists tell us today, is there were wadis. Anybody know what a wadi is? A river valley, a giant river valley. So if you think about the rain that occurs in the course of the year, and all this rain that's accumulating in Jerusalem, it's got to run downhill. Water runs downhill. And when it did, it would carve into the ground, it would carve out these great valleys. And there were 5 valleys that ran down off the mountain area towards the coastal plain. And those 5 valleys were the way that people would travel from the coastal plain up into the highlands. And if you look at this particular map, it gives you an idea as to, you know, the extent of the hike. When you're traveling, you've got to be hoofing it uphill to get to the Jerusalem area. And to do that, they would, instead of climbing the rough terrain in this central region, this buffer region between the coastal and the mountaintop, they would walk through these Wadi River valleys. Much of what we read about in the Old Testament takes place in what's referred to as the Shephelah. The Shephelah was the region that was serving as what I've put on the slide here, a buffer zone. It was a very strategic place militarily. And when you look in the scriptures, there are times when we can read about fortified cities. How when the Jews, when the Israelites were in the land, they created fortified or fenced cities or walled cities. And when you plot out where these cities are located, they're all guarding these Wadi River valleys because it was a strategic place. It was so important that they control who could get into those valleys and who could easily climb up and fight against the Jews and their cities that were predominantly located at the top of the mountain. And so, when we come to the story of the Israelites battling the Philistines, we find them fighting in one of these 5 Wadi River valleys. And it's called the Valley of Elah. It was a strategically important place because it was the fork in the road that allowed you to walk through the flat land of the coastal plain and then come to the fork that would lead you one way up to Hebron and the other way up to Bethlehem. And because this was the access point to those important cities in the north, the Israelites decided, and rightly so, that they needed to guard these things, that they needed to protect these places in order to protect the cities and the people that lived on the top of the mountain. So what happened is the Philistines, their strategy was to go to the Valley of Elah and to go up into the mountains and to effectively divide the nation of Israel in half. They wanted to get up on the northern side, and they wanted to create a split so that on the north you had Gibeah and Jerusalem, and on the south you had Bethlehem and Hebron, and that now this unified nation is going to be divided with the army of the Philistines between them. And strategically, this was a very important approach. If they could accomplish this, the Philistine army would have a great advantage over the Israelites. Now, this was not news to the Israelites. And that's why the goal of Saul and the goal of the Israelites was to cut them off at the pass. They wanted to go down and they wanted to protect that Valley of Elah and make sure that these invading people couldn't get on the roads that would lead up to the cities. And so the goal of Saul and the Israelites was to prevent the Philistines from taking those roads. And as a result, when we come to 1 Samuel chapter 17, we look at the first verse, and it says, "Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled in Socoh in Judah, and they pitched camp at Ephes Dammim between Socoh and Azekah." Now, the picture you see on the slide here is a photo from that very place. And you will be able to notice on your right-hand side and on your left-hand side of the slide 2 knolls, 2 hills. And it's thought that this is the very place where the Philistines encamped on one hill and the Israelites encamped on the other hill. And in between these hills, you had this flat river valley that provided the great amphitheater where the fighting would take place. So when we look at 1 Samuel chapter 17, we find out that the Israelites dug in on one hill, the Philistines dug in on the other hill. They've got this flat valley with a dry creek bed between them, and they're ready to fight. But it wasn't as easy as that. So let's spend some time now going through 1 Samuel chapter 17 and try and paint the picture for what this warfare, what the tension was like as the two armies waited. Because when we look at verse 16, we see that it was a period of almost 6 weeks where the army stared across this valley at one another. Verse 16, for 40 days the Philistines came forward every morning and evening. The Philistine, the Goliath, came forward every morning and evening and took his stand. You know, when we're reading the Bible, it's so easy just to sort of like read right over that. But all of a sudden you stop and you think, wait a minute, every day for 40 days? That's a long stinking time. You know, they're sitting there for almost 6 weeks trying to figure out how they're going to deal with this guy. They've got to find food during that 6 weeks period. They know that they've got wives and children at home. They've got crops that need to be tended to. They've got animals that need to be fed. And for 6 weeks, they're just like sitting there. Jeff.
If I'm taunting you twice a day for 40 days, I'm going to ramp it up every single time and make it worse and worse and get more and more personal and mean and rough. By the time David shows up on the 40th day, I'm sure it was really rough.
Yeah. Yeah, and we get a sense of that. Like, look at verse 11. And it wasn't just the Israelites. It was their king. Remember, Saul, their king, who's head and shoulders above everybody else. He's the strong man of the country. And verse 11 says, on hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. So, twice a day, he's ramping it up, and it's having its desired effect. So they're afraid. And it was more than just the words that the Philistines spoke. It was his presence. Everything about him just exuded this invincibility. So let's walk through and take a look. It says, verse 4, a champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. He was over 9 feet tall, it says in the NIV. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. A couple of comments about that. So there are two, the translators of the NIV have translated his height according to, a cubit. And there were different measures of cubits. There was an imperial cubit. There were all sorts of things. A lot of people today are suggesting that Goliath wasn't quite 9 foot 6 inches tall, but was more like 6 foot 9 inches tall, based on the length of the standard cubit of his time. I don't know if anybody's heard that. But nevertheless, if you've walked through Paul Revere's house here in Boston, people like Jim Boyko and I have to duck to get through the doorway. And we're 6'2", James would have to duck. He's 6'3". People, during the Revolutionary War time were a lot smaller in stature than they are today. And it's likely the case in the days of David and Goliath as well. So even if Goliath were 6'9" instead of over 9 feet tall, he was still a giant in comparison to the people. Any questions or comments about that? Next thing we see is it says in verse 5 that he's carrying this bronze helmet. He has a bronze helmet on his head. He's got a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. Now, some of you know our son Dan. Dan, when he was in, was it junior high school? Dan got the idea that he would make a coat of metal armor. It was a chainmail vest that he made. And it was fascinating to see him do it. He went down to Home Depot and he bought a spool of wire, heavy gauge wire. And he put it on a long metal rod that he had drilled a hole in, and he like threaded the needle through the end of this hole. And then the other end of the rod he affixed to a drill, like an electric drill. And he turned the drill on, and it turned the rod, and it caused the wire to spool to wrap around this drill. And then Dan went and he pulled this now long coil off and began clipping it. And then he would tie each one of these things together and somehow created a coat of armor out of this. It was the most bizarre thing. Sandy and I were watching him do this every day. He'd get in the car and we'd take a trip to someplace, and Dan would be doing this. And when he got done, we picked this thing up, and how much did it weigh, Peter? 35 pounds. 35 pounds. And so what we're reading here is Saul has a coat of armor, and it weighs 5,000 shekels. And if you look at the note anyway in the NIV, it tells us that this is 125 pounds. And Jim Boyko has just pointed out that David was probably under 20, because if he were of fighting age, he'd be there. So David now is coming, and Jim, I'm guessing that when you were under 20 years old, you were a little leaner than you are today. 60 pounds ago, right? And I can say the same of myself, okay? And so if you are, a 17-year-old young man, 125 pounds of armor is just going to be ridiculous, right? And this is what Goliath is wearing. It goes on. It says, on his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. And he had a spear shaft that was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. The marginal note tells us that that's 15 pounds. Now, Bob Eagles isn't here with us today. But when I was at Bible school, at the Eastern Christadelphian Bible School, when it was held at Wilbraham, there was a very famous married men, single men softball tournament. And one year, in preparation for this game, softball game, Bob, in high school, turned on a lathe a baseball bat. And I think to say that it was a baseball bat, I don't know if Bob's watching, but I think that would be a bit of a stretch of the imagination. I went and picked this thing up, and I could hardly lift the thing. It was so heavy. Now, Bob was a lot bigger and stronger than me, and that kid could hit the ball. And Bob would get that thing, the pitch would come in, and he would be able to get the rotation on that bat, and when it hit the softball, that ball was gone. But to me, whenever I've read this story about Goliath and this 15-pound spearhead, I think of Bob Eagles' big bat. I think he had a name for it. You'll have to share that with us, Bob. But as an Israelite, looking out and seeing this infantryman in this getup, it's something that they would not have even been able to comprehend. And the result, the consequence of this taunting, the consequence of his appearance, was that they were all afraid and dismayed. And that's what we read in verse 11 earlier. Verse 8, Goliath stood and he shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? Am I not just one Philistine? And are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me." Now, what we're seeing here, brothers and sisters, is we're seeing a technique, or we're seeing a part of ancient warfare that was referred to as single combat. It was a way in which armies could settle disputes without the mass loss of life. This was before the days of penicillin. You get a nick on your arm with a rusty blade. I mean, it might not be that big a deal until the infection sets in. And consequently, warfare in these days saw so many lives lost, partly because of infection. And as a result of things like this, part of the ancient warfare was to have single combat. And that's where it was a duel. Let's duel. And they would go out and they would, face each other, and they would be, 50 yards apart, and then they would fight. And depending on which of those single warfare warriors would win, would determine who would get the spoil. It was a duel between two single warriors designed to settle disputes without incurring the bloodshed of a major battle. Now, Rich, I am not the scholar that you are, but in one of these Greek, what's the battle scene that we see in...
In the Iliad,
That's what it is.
they had
Business major here.
Agamemnon went against Paris to fight on a one-on-one because Paris took Helen, right? And so they were going to fight outside the city of Troy, but Paris was too much of a, win.
Can you just repeat that on the microphone
Oh, yeah.
for folks? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, so in Homer's The Iliad, there is actually a scene. There's a couple scenes, but most famously is Agamemnon, who was head of the Greek forces, was going to fight a one-on-one battle against Paris because Paris had stolen Helen and brought her to Troy. But Paris, he didn't have the physical skill, so Paris's brother Hector took the place, and they, had a little skirmish.
And this
there.
was a single combat
Single
battle.
combat. It was
It was done on a bridge or something, is that right?
just right outside the city of Troy, yeah.
Okay.
But this is how they did things in the bronze, the late Bronze Age. You had your big guy and another guy over here, and you fought it out.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. What did you say?
It's like a business meeting.
Like a business meeting. So years ago, we had Dan Stiles here for study weekend, and Dan gave a great series of classes. And at one point during his weekend, he talked about the business meetings they have at Livonia, and they decided that they would no longer call them business meetings. What do they call them, Jim? Love fests or family meetings or something like that. And so, you go into it that way. And I think, we've got great business meetings. Coming up October 4th, by the way. Okay. So thanks for that backstory, Rich. Really helpful. Really helpful. So, it goes to show that this was a very well-known form of warfare in those days. And so when you think about ancient warfare, there were really three types of warriors. There was cavalry. These were the chariots that you'd see in Egypt. There was infantry. This is what we see with the Philistines and with Goliath. And then there was artillery. Artillery when I think of artillery, what do you guys think of? Cannons? Howitzers. Okay, put yourself back a few years, before gunpowder. Say it again? Catapults. Yeah, catapults. Or how about archers? Archers. But you know what one of the most effective forms of artillery was? It was the sling. It was the sling. And when you think about a sling, it's not the slingshot of, the 1950s child toy that puts your brother's eye out, right? It was a cord. Now, I don't know if this is going to work. Phil, do you know whether we'll have audio if I put some audio on? Let's find out. But what you're going to see here, and I think I've shown this before to the CYC, perhaps you've seen it. But what you're going to see here is two things. The first thing I want to do is I want to highlight the verse from Judges. Because Judges chapter 20 describes the artillery in ancient warfare, and particularly within Israel itself. Judges 20, verse 16 says, "Among all these soldiers there were 700 select troops who were left-handed, each of whom could sling a stone at a hair and not miss." The other day, our son Paul was in our backyard. He picked up a baseball, And Sandy told me there was something on the ground and you challenged him to throw it and hit it. And there was like a basketball on the ground. And Sandy said, why don't you throw that tennis ball, see if you can hit the basketball, which was on the other side of the yard. Of course, Paul picked the thing up and bullet straight hit the ball. I couldn't do that in a million years. But if you are now a shepherd boy and you're spending your days not with your hand in your face, holding a phone, playing games and checking the internet, you're saying, what am I going to do? Okay, I woke up at 4 o'clock when the sun got up. What am I going to do for the next 12, 15, 16 hours? I know. I'll do some target practice. These kids got pretty good at it. So what you're going to see here is a young man who has a sling in his hand, and he's practicing. And he's able to get a stone and with that stone and hit his neck each and every time. And I venture to guess that this young boy probably hasn't spent the last 5 years of his life out in a field with nothing to do but practice his slinging. When you use a sling, they tell us, we're running out of time. They tell us that the sling, the stone, is probably traveling at 6 revolutions or more per second. And when that stone is let go, it has the stopping power of a .45 caliber weapon. This is a picture of Michelangelo's David. And if you go around the back of the statue, you can see, did you guys see David when you went out to Florence? Amazing, wasn't it? I think it was Sandy's favorite part of the trip. But David is actually, in that statue, has something in his right hand. And when you look, it's actually a stone. It's his sling. It's the stone that he's going to use in his sling. And they say that these stones weren't necessarily the size of a little pebble. They were about the size of a cue ball. And so now we might ask the question, when you look at the story of David and Goliath, who's the underdog? You've got Goliath, who is so big that the nation of Israel and Saul says, he's too big to fight. And you've got David, who looks at Saul and says, he's too big to miss. Right? And so David goes out, and he now has a stationary target who's huge. David, not in a second, had any doubt. Not only did he have the skill to do so, but he had God. David had no expectation that he was going to go out and fight Goliath hand to hand. His full expectation was that he would go out not as an infantryman, but as an artilleryman. And he was able to use his sling to defend his flock and use that practice to destroy Goliath. David was never the underdog, and most importantly, he had God on his side. I come to thee in the name of Yahweh of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. This day Yahweh will deliver thee into my hand, and I will smite thee. And so